Good afternoon. I'm Carolyn Hiller, the Clinical Diagnostics Program Manager, and it has been a really exciting year this year for clinical diagnostics. I'd like to introduce Rick Naples, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Regulatory Officer at BD, and he's also the board champion for clinical diagnostics. Rick has been a tireless advocate for using regulatory science to expedite innovation in clinical diagnostics. Rick?
Thank you, Carolyn. Good afternoon, everybody. Are we having a good day? I think so. And it's been great to see all the smart people in this room talking about regulatory science. And I'd just like to start off by saying, for BD, it's been such a pleasure being one of the founding members of MDIC and being on the board. And it's really exciting for me to work and see the vision that Jeff Shern has had for this public-private partnership, and also the efforts that Bill Murray and his team, especially Carolyn, have put forward to fulfill that mission. Together, we're making a difference, and so I'm excited to be here today to talk a little bit about the new Clinical Diagnostics Program. We're not quite as far along as some of the other programs, but we're building momentum quickly and delighted to share that with you. But before I do, I want to tell you some of the value that BD and its patients have already received from being part of MDIC. We started over a couple years ago with Dawn Bardot and her team and started working on computer modeling and simulation. And in doing so, we found the opportunity to collaborate with FDA on good science even before we had a product. And in having those scientific discussions, we were able to see a path forward where we implemented computer modeling and simulation through the good work of Anita Besselmeyer on our team. Anita, wave, say hello. She's done fantastic work to show how we can develop a new product and test hundreds of different designs much more quickly and efficiently than ever before through modeling, which has allowed us to bring the product to market and through FDA even faster. So there's tremendous value in these programs. Starting there, we then moved forward with Lisa Vincent Griffin, who's done a great job helping us determine how we could use the virtual patient. And we do believe that someday we'll be able to use that to supplement our clinical trials. So if you haven't been involved with MDIC, or if you think the focus is not in your main line of your businesses, you're wrong, because these processes apply across the life cycle of products. So very quickly, I'll just give you a sense of where we're at in the process, if I can find where the end is. Okay. I want to let you know why we started the Clinical Diagnostics Program. First, because BD has clinical diagnostics. We pushed for that. And we got a strong resonance with the rest of the diagnostics industry. And if you look at diagnostics, you recognize that 70% of all treatment decisions are based on diagnostics. So it's no wonder that diagnostics are growing so fast. And as you'll see in this slide, the annual growth rate is about 5%, and the size of the industry is expected to reach at least $67 billion by the year 2020. So diagnostics are incredibly important, high value, return on investment, and earlier and better diagnosis can improve public health. And I would add, in my own opinion, that if we're going to hit the cancer moonshot, we're going to need much better diagnostics. So precision diagnostics will be key to the future. We've come pretty far pretty fast in the last 2 years. We held a meeting with other companies, got the stakeholders together, and as we built momentum, we had to determine where do we start, because there's such a rich area of opportunity. In diagnostics, there's products that have been on the market for 40 years that have become the standard of care. There's also novel diagnostics and next-gen sequencing, and a plethora of new technologies out there. So we had to focus our efforts. So through a number of discussions over the last year with all stakeholders, and I might say that I'm especially pleased that it wasn't just FDA and industry, it was also CMS, because we talked about the importance not only of getting approval, but also determining if this technology is cost effective and if it can improve public health, and CMS should determine how to pay for it. So very important from a total product life cycle standpoint and market entry. And as we sat together, we came up with a total product lifecycle approach that looks at design of IVDs to analytical studies, clinical studies, and all the way to reporting test results. And we came up with 4 initiatives that we've launched that were approved by the steering committee. The first one is contrived specimens, which is a fancy name for simulated samples. Simulated samples have long been used to help supplement clinical trial data, but there's no standards for them. And sometimes they're accepted by the agency, sometimes not, because the agency's seen some issues with them. So it only makes sense that we work together to standardize the approach. And that team's working hard to gather good science, to gather the experience that's out there today in FDA and in industry through a big survey, and then take that survey data, crunch that, and figure out how we can develop a white paper around standards. And the kind of model we're using, or the process we're using there, we're using also for incremental improvements in low and moderate risk devices. You know, we've talked about the novel technology, but it's also important to recognize that FDA gets lots of submissions for changes to existing products. So it would only make sense to determine a better way to assess the safety and effectiveness in the most efficient manner. The other initiatives are on the clinical side and dovetail very nicely with all the work that's being done by MDIC and also FDA strategic initiatives. We have a clinical evidence framework and requirements for IVDs. We want to better define how we determine clinical usefulness. How useful is the assay or the test system in improving public health? And being an IVD guy for so many years, I could get into a lot of the details on that, on analytical utility, clinical validity. But the bottom line is, how do we show it's clinically useful in the most efficient and effective way? Not the least, though, we have to recognize that test results are now part of EHRs, which is great. But if you look at some of the studies around EHR and IVDs, you'll find that there's no standard nomenclature around it. So it's making it very difficult to leverage that data maximally. So it's really important for us to look at semantic interoperability for IVDs. So those are our 4 projects that cover the total product lifecycle. And the goal ultimately is very much aligned with MDIC's overall goal and FDA's. This is to foster an environment of scientific expertise. And what's really great is to have the right people around the table with good science constructively challenging each other on some of the most vexing issues so that we can alleviate the burdens for FDA, for industry, and most importantly, remember there's a patient at the end of beginning and end of everything we do. So let's do our best to increase patient access. And we're getting bigger, better, and bolder in 2016 and beyond. As you can see, the list of companies has now grown. Delighted that Roche has now joined team. That's a great, they're great leaders in the industry, and it's great to have them. But you can see the list is getting bigger. The list of government agencies and related groups has also grown. And on the right side, you'll see the different trade associations and some of the work they're doing to help us. In addition to what you see here in terms of the clinical diagnostics engagement, we're also going to be reaching out to the clinical lab groups. The College of American Pathologists has great experience with proficiency test samples, so they simulate samples, so that should be really helpful to us to tell us what samples work with what assays and what doesn't. And then also we'll be reaching out to other organizations like Clinical Lab Standards Institutes, because we believe they could be great partners in providing input to our ideas, and also at some point they would probably be customers for some of the deliverables in terms of the white papers we'll be developing. So that's the summary of where we're at today. Again, very excited on what we've accomplished to this point. A lot more work to do, and now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Alberto Gutierrez. For those of you that don't know Alberto like I do, he started out and has a master's and doctorate degree from Princeton in chemistry. He then joined industry and was a researcher for 10 years. After that, he joined the agency in 1992 in the Center for Biologics and came to the Center for Devices in 2000. He worked his way up the ranks and is now the center director. And I can tell you that he's been a great partner for industry. And Jeff, you'll like this. He's tough on science, and he always promotes good science, and he puts safety first. But he's also good at opening his mind and the approach the agency takes to innovation. So, Alberto?
Yeah, I'm not sure Jeff likes me being tough. We have some good discussions. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have a couple of slides. I'm just going to give you a feel as to why we chose the areas that we chose, and a feel for what is happening in diagnostics and where the challenges are. And diagnostics really is an area that is changing extremely quickly. Really, if you look at what's happening, particularly with the technologies that we have now, the sequencing that can be done, the amount of information that we get, the different biomarkers that have been identified, new techniques that are able to dig either parts or whole genomes, are able to actually identify different proteins in a mass of proteins that is usually in the blood. It really is a time where things are moving quite quickly. That presents a lot of challenges. Some of the challenges are, even to the way we look, and we have gotten to look at diagnostics, in which we have leveraged from the beginning. Diagnostics, in a sense, is different in that we don't do clinical trials in the same way. And we have leveraged studies, if you like, laboratory studies, to determine how well a device works. And sometimes those studies get more and more complicated as we understand what interferes, what kind of things we need to look at. But they're typically not your typical clinical trial type of study. They can get quite complicated. As we heard today, BD has to do many, many studies in many ways, and that happens because we use samples that are either stored or we use contrived samples and whenever you do that, you have the possibility of introducing biases, and when we learn what kind of biases can be introduced, then we have a different study that tends to get to whether those biases exist or not. Do you have for glucose meters? We find out, for example, that oxygen can be a problem. So you now do studies to make sure that your enzyme is not oxygen sensitive. So that's the way we have always approached that. It becomes more of an issue once you begin to multiplex. And you can't do a study of reproducibility on each analyte that you're going to detect, because now you have millions of analytes, and or even before we get to that, if you have 20 analytes, the matrix becomes very difficult to do, because to do reproducibility for each one of those 20 requires a lot of work. So we are constantly looking for ways to determine quality, and determine quality based on either parts of the assay itself or representative parts. And then when that happens, again, we get into this issue of whenever you're doing contrived samples, whenever you're doing part of it, you need to make sure that you are taking into account all potential problems and that you're looking at them in an appropriate way. So it's in the background of a lot of what's going on and some of the studies that we're doing, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. All the things that are happening, though, are things like tests moving closer to the patient, which means that a laboratorian is not necessarily involved anymore. And so the tests have to be a lot more robust, and what we do to look at that and make sure that it can be run at either at a CLIA wave site, a doctor's office type of thing, or even by patients, and what do we need do to guarantee that. So those are issues that we think about too. The tests become increasingly complex. We have difficulty in finding samples, particularly as we move to areas where we have rare variants, for example, and we can't always find real samples to test, and that's part of the contrived sample too. Increasing demands in demanding evidence and utility, and emerging disease. Those are all issues that we typically deal with diagnostics. So, as Rick said, we have designed the 4 projects that we started really are designed within the context of the total product life cycle. The first part is really defining what kind of studies can you do, what kind of samples can you use, and how can you use those samples. The second part is what kind of clinical evidence we need. Incremental improvements is a tremendously important part for us, because you can't keep doing huge validation every time that you change something. And so determining what kind of change requires real validation and a lot of work, or what kind of change can be leveraged with the information you previously have, and what do you need to do to verify that the change didn't change the performance of the device. And so that's a crucial part of the way we look at this and the way things are controlled. And lastly, but not least, and I really want to stress this one, and this one is a little unusual, is that we're trying to find a home to what is really the crux of even Dr. McCollum's last talk, to the data itself. If we don't have good data, and if 70% of all clinical decisions are being done with vitro diagnostic data, if we don't have good data, we're not going to be able to do any of the NEST or anything around. And the truth is that we actually don't have interoperability right now. And therefore, working on being able to do that is important. It's been difficult because actually nobody owns this space. The laboratories, the manufacturers, CDC, FDA, nobody has really owned this space in the past. And therefore, getting to consensus on how to move this it's been very difficult. So we're hoping that finding at home at the MDIC, we can at least get that under control so that other projects such as the NEST can actually be fruitful. And I believe that's what I had to present.